The day the sky cracked open above Ridgeline, Montana, nobody was ready for it. It was a Tuesday. A normal, cold, forgettable Tuesday in October, the kind where the wind comes down off the mountains and bites through your jacket like it has a personal grudge. The trees along Route 12 had already gone orange and brown, and the highway was empty except for a beat-up white pickup truck rattling its way toward town. Behind the wheel was Danny Marsh, 34 years old, a former Army combat engineer who now worked as a structural inspector for Gallatin County. He had a thermos of bad coffee, a country station playing low on the radio, and absolutely zero plans to witness the most important moment in human history. He almost missed it. The light came first. Not a flash, more like a slow bloom, like someone had lit a match on the underside of the clouds. Danny glanced up through the windshield and squinted. His first thought was that a transformer had blown somewhere on the ridge. His second thought, when the light didn't stop and instead spread into a wide, pulsing aurora of deep violet and silver, was that he had no idea what he was looking at. He pulled over. He stepped out of the truck and stood on the gravel shoulder with his coffee thermos in one hand and his mouth hanging open. The sky above the valley was moving. Not clouds, something inside the clouds, something massive, descending in a slow, lopsided spiral like a coin that had been spun on a table and was winding down. Then the noise hit him. It wasn't an explosion. It was deeper than that. It was a sound that Danny Marsh would spend the rest of his life struggling to describe. A low, resonant groan that seemed to come from inside the ground itself, from inside his chest, from somewhere behind his eyes. It vibrated his back teeth and made his coffee thermos buzz in his hand. The clouds parted, and the thing came through. It was enormous. That was the first word. Enormous in a way that broke something in Danny's brain because his brain kept trying to put it into context, trying to compare it to buildings he'd seen, to bridges he'd inspected, to mountains he'd stood next to, and kept failing. The object was shaped like nothing natural. It had a long central spine, maybe 3 miles from end to end, with massive structural flanges extending off it like the fins of some ancient deep-sea creature. Parts of it were dark and cold. Parts of it still glowed with dying systems, with flickering lights that pulsed orange and red and then faded. Sections of the hull were missing entirely, blown open, exposing twisted internal frameworks that caught the morning light and reflected it in strange, irregular patterns. It was falling. Slowly, far too slowly for something that size, which meant something was still working inside it, some dampening field or gravity brake that was barely functioning. It drifted across the valley in a low, agonizing arc and then it came down. The impact shook the ground 40 miles in every direction. Seismographs in Denver and Calgary registered it. Windows broke in Bozeman. Danny Marsh was knocked off his feet and sat on the gravel shoulder with his ears ringing and his heart slamming in his chest, staring at the column of dust and debris that was rising from the far end of the valley. He sat there for a full 2 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called 911. He paused. Swallowed. There's a spaceship. In the valley. Off Route 12, past the old Hendricks property. Yeah. It's a spaceship. No, I'm not. Ma'am, I am stone cold sober. I need you to call whoever you call for this. The 911 dispatcher. Her name was Carol and she had worked the line for 19 years, paused for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay on the line." Within 6 hours, the valley had been cordoned off by the Montana National Guard. Within 12 hours, FEMA, the DoD, NASA, and 3 agencies whose names were never released to the public had established a perimeter. Within 24 hours, satellite imagery of the site was being reviewed in the Pentagon, the White House Situation Room, and at a secure facility outside of Colorado Springs that most people didn't know existed. Within 48 hours, Dr. Elena Vasquez got the call. Elena was 39, a materials scientist and aerospace engineer who split her time between DARPA and the University of Colorado at Boulder. She had 2 published papers on exotic matter behavior under non-standard gravity conditions, which was, as one of her colleagues once joked, the single most useless specialty you could have, right up until the moment it becomes the most important specialty in human history. That moment had arrived. She flew into Bozeman on a military transport, was driven to the site in a convoy of black SUVs, and was handed a hard hat and a radiation badge at the gate of what was now being called Site Omaha, though the name would change 17 more times over the next 4 years. She suited up, walked through the outer perimeter, past the rings of fencing and the military hardware and the generators humming in the cold morning air, and came around a low ridge and saw it for the first time. She stopped walking. Behind her, Colonel James Whitford, her military liaison, a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped gray hair and the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by things a very long time ago, waited patiently while she processed what she was seeing. "Take your time," he said. "Everybody does." Elena stared for a long time. The ship filled the valley. Up close, it was even harder to make sense of it. The sheer scale of it, the alien geometry of its construction, the way light moved across its surfaces in ways that didn't quite match what light was supposed to do. She could see the damage clearly now. The central spine was fractured in at least 3 places. One of the massive flange structures had sheared away during impact and lay half buried in the earth nearby. The exposed internal sections were a chaos of twisted metal, except it wasn't metal, not exactly. It was something that looked like metal but had a quality to it, a depth, like it was more solid than solid, more real than real. "Who was flying it?" she asked quietly. "Unknown," Whitford said. "No life signs. No bodies. No crew. Whoever was operating this thing left before it came down. Or they didn't survive the original damage. What caused the damage? Also unknown. But based on what we're seeing," he paused. "Dr. Vasquez, this ship wasn't in an accident. Those aren't collision marks. Somebody shot the hell out of it." Elena turned to look at him. "A battle?" she said. "That's the working theory." She looked back at the ship. A battle. In space. Which meant there was something up there, beyond the edge of what humanity could see or reach, that was capable of fighting a battle that left a 3-mile-long warship looking like this. "Who won?" she asked. Whitford was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is the question that keeps the president up at night." Elena pulled her hard hat on, checked her radiation badge and started walking toward the ship. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." The first 6 months were, in Elena's private notes, an extended exercise in professional humiliation. Every tool they brought to bear on the ship failed to do what it was supposed to do. Drill bits made of tungsten carbide, material hard enough to cut through almost anything on Earth, touched the outer hull and came away unchanged. Not dulled. Not worn. Unchanged, as if they'd never made contact at all, even when the surface showed clear scoring marks from the attempt. Electron microscopes couldn't get a clear read on the material's crystalline structure because the structure kept shifting at the quantum level, doing something that should have been impossible for a solid object. Standard spectroscopic analysis returned readings that 2 separate labs independently described as internally contradictory. The ship, in short, was made of something that Earth science didn't have a framework for. But Elena hadn't built her career by giving up when frameworks failed. She built it by building new frameworks. She assembled a team. Not just physicists and engineers, she pulled in materials scientists, nanotechnologists, a chemist from MIT who had done radical work on metamaterials, a cognitive scientist who specialized in problem-solving under uncertainty. She brought in Marcus Webb, a structural engineer from Chicago who had a gift for reading buildings the way other people read faces, understanding their stress points and load paths and hidden logic just by looking at them. She brought in Yuki Tanaka, a 30-year-old AI systems specialist from Stanford who communicated mostly in rapid-fire technical shorthand and had a habit of solving problems that everyone else had declared unsolvable. And she kept Daniel Marsh. This surprised everyone, including Danny. He wasn't a scientist. He didn't have a PhD. He had a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Montana State and 12 years of experience looking at structures and figuring out why they were broken. But Elena had read the initial report he'd filed with the county about the ship's descent trajectory and structural behavior during landing, and she recognized something in it, a particular way of thinking, a mechanical intuition, that she didn't want to lose. "You're hired," she told him, over terrible coffee in the site's prefab command center. "Technically you're on loan from Gallatin County as a structural assessment consultant, but practically you're on my team. Don't let anyone else tell you differently." Danny looked at his coffee cup. "I don't know anything about alien spaceships," he said. "Nobody does," Elena said. "That's the point. I need people who know about structures, not about preconceptions. Can you do that?" He thought about it for a second. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." The breakthrough came 7 months in, and it came from a direction nobody expected. Marcus Webb had been mapping the ship's internal framework, the sections exposed by the hull damage, with a combination of ground-penetrating radar and good old-fashioned visual inspection from elevated platforms they'd constructed along the ship's side. He'd been at it for weeks, quietly building a picture of how the interior spaces related to each other, how load was transferred through the structure, how the alien engineers had organized the internal systems. He came to Elena one evening with a tablet full of diagrams and a look on his face that she'd learned to recognize, the look of a man who had figured something out that he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to have figured out. "It's a truss system," he said. He pulled up his diagrams and laid them out on the table. The internal framework. Struts and nodes, load paths, compression and tension members. It's a space frame. It's an incredibly advanced, incredibly sophisticated space frame, but the underlying logic is the same as what you'd use to build a stadium or a bridge. Triangulated members transferring load through geometry rather than material strength. Elena stared at the diagrams. You're saying they think like us? Structurally? Or we think like them? But yes. He tapped one of the diagrams. And that means we can read this. We can understand it. Because the logic of structures is the logic of structures. It doesn't matter if you're human or whatever built this thing. Forces still go where forces go. This was the key that unlocked everything. Once they understood the structural logic, they could start identifying systems. The framework organized around nodes, and the nodes organized around what appeared to be functional clusters. Power, propulsion, control, life support. The power cluster, near the ship's midpoint, was organized around a core component that was about the size of a shipping container and made of a material that was somehow even stranger than the hull. A material that Yuki Tanaka's instruments identified as existing partially in a quantum superposition state, simultaneously occupying multiple configurations at once. It's not broken, Yuki said one night in the lab with the slightly unfocused look she got when she was thinking faster than she could talk. The power core. Everyone's been treating it like it's dead, but it's not dead. It's in a kind of, I don't have a good word for this, it's in a hibernation state. Like an emergency shutdown. Like something triggered a failsafe. Can you wake it up? Elena asked. Yuki was quiet for a long time. Maybe, she said finally. Not soon. But maybe. Meanwhile, Danny Marsh had been doing something that nobody else on the team had bothered to do. He'd been climbing. Not into the interior. Access to the interior was still heavily controlled and required full hazmat gear. But along the outside. Along the exterior surfaces, through the exposed sections around the damage. He'd been spending his days on rope lines and temporary scaffolding, moving across the ship's surface, and he'd been doing what he always did when he looked at a broken structure, looking for why it broke. He brought his findings to Elena on a Saturday morning when the site was quieter than usual. The damage, he said. He spread printed photos across the table. Look at the damage patterns. Elena looked. Weapons fire, she said. We know that. Not just weapons fire. Look at the directionality. Look at where each hit came from. He'd drawn arrows on the photos, tracing the angle of each impact, each rupture, each blown section. All of these, he traced a cluster, come from the same direction. Same angle of incidence. But these, he traced another cluster, come from behind. From aft. And these, a third cluster, from below. Elena was quiet looking at the pattern. Multiple attackers, she said. 3 separate firing solutions minimum. They hit this thing from 3 directions simultaneously. He paused. And look at this section here. This is the communications array, or what I think is the communications array based on the antenna structures. It was the first thing they hit. Before the engines. Before anything else. They cut off its ability to call for help, Elena said. That's what it looks like to me, Danny said. He was quiet for a moment. These guys knew what they were doing. They'd done it before. They had a plan and they executed it, and this ship. He paused. Whoever was on this ship never had a chance. Elena sat back in her chair. She thought about what that meant. About what was out there, beyond the edge of the solar system, that could do something like this. We need to understand this ship, she said. Not just what it's made of. Not just how it works. We need to understand everything about it. Because whatever destroyed it is still out there. Danny nodded slowly. That's what I figured too. Part 3, The Language in the Walls. It was Yuki Tanaka who found the data core, and it was Yuki Tanaka who nearly lost her mind trying to read it. The core was located in what they'd started calling the ship's head, the forward section of the central spine, in a compartment that had survived the damage largely intact. Getting to it had required drilling access corridors through 3 sections of internal bulkhead, a process that had taken 2 months and consumed 17 custom-fabricated cutting tools that were each destroyed after contact with the bulkhead material. The core itself was a sphere about 2 feet in diameter, made of the same quantum superposition material as the power core. It was warm to the touch. Not uncomfortably warm, but warm in a way that felt deliberate, like a hand on a shoulder. The first thing they learned about the data core was that it was alive. Not alive in a biological sense. There was no metabolism, no cellular structure, nothing that would satisfy a biologist's definition. But it was active. It was running processes. It was, by any reasonable definition of the word, thinking. It's not just storage, Yuki said. She was in the main analysis lab at 2 in the morning, surrounded by instruments and takeout containers and the accumulated detritus of someone who had stopped going home. It's an AI. Or something like an AI. It's a system that's been running continuously for, based on decay rates in the quantum substrate, at least 400 years. The room got very quiet. 400 years, Colonel Whitford said. He'd taken to showing up at unexpected hours. Elena suspected he didn't sleep much anymore. This ship has been running for 400 years? Not the ship, Yuki corrected. The core. The ship is maybe 30 years old based on the structural wear. The core is much older. They put it on this ship. She paused. Or the core put itself on this ship. I'm not entirely sure which. Elena looked at the sphere in its containment cradle. Can we communicate with it? I've been trying. Yuki pulled up a screen full of signal analysis. It's been responding to our instruments, giving back signals that are clearly responses, not just reflections. But the format is, I don't have a word for this either. It's not a language the way we think of language. It's more like, it's multidimensional. Information encoded in patterns that have meaning in several directions simultaneously. Like a hologram, Marcus said. Exactly like a hologram. Every piece contains information about the whole. Yuki rubbed her eyes. I've been trying to find something it can map onto. Something we share. Mathematics, Elena said. I started there. Prime numbers, geometric sequences, the usual first contact stuff. It acknowledged them. But it's like, imagine you could speak English and someone shows you they can count. They know you can count. But can you have a conversation? Can you tell them what happened to your ship? Silence. What if, Danny Marsh said quietly from the back of the room. He had a habit of positioning himself on the edges and listening until he had something to say. What if you don't start with math? What if you start with structure? Everyone looked at him. It's a ship's AI, right? Its whole existence for 400 years has been about structure. About the ship. About load and force and geometry. He walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. What if you showed it a structural diagram? Of the ship? Something it would recognize because it knows the ship. Yuki stared at him for a long second. Then she grabbed her tablet and started building the diagram. It took 4 hours. She built a complete structural schematic of the ship based on Marcus's framework maps, simplified it into a 2-dimensional form, and transmitted it to the core via the electromagnetic interface they'd built. The core's response came in 11 seconds. What it sent back was the same schematic but corrected. Detailed. Annotated with information in its own multidimensional format. Information that they couldn't read yet, but that was clearly organized, clearly meaningful, clearly a response to what they'd sent. And in the corrections it made to their diagram, the places where they'd gotten the structure wrong, the missing components it added, the systems it indicated that they hadn't identified, there was something that could only be called intent. It was trying to help them understand. Hello, Yuki whispered. Over the next 6 months they built a bridge. Not a language exactly, something more pragmatic than language. A shared system of structural and functional notation that both sides could use. The AI, Elena started calling it core and the name stuck, turned out to be extraordinarily patient. It communicated through the interface in careful, layered packets of information, always starting simple, always building up, always pausing when it sensed confusion and backing up and trying a different path. Elena found herself thinking of it as a very good teacher. Or maybe a very good doctor. Someone who had a great deal of information that needed to be conveyed to someone who didn't yet have the vocabulary to receive it, and who was willing to spend whatever time it took to bridge that gap. What they learned over those 6 months was terrifying. The ship was called, as far as they could render the concept, something like the Wayward Reach. It had been a deep exploration vessel belonging to a civilization called, again approximately, the Keth. The Keth were an old species. Not as old as some, core communicated carefully, but old. They had been spacefaring for 7,000 years. They had established contact with dozens of other species. They had been, by most accounts, peaceful, explorers more than conquerors, scholars more than warriors. Had been. The Keth were gone. The Wayward Reach was one of the last ships they had ever built, completed in the final decade before what Core described, in structural terms, in the collapse of complex systems under catastrophic load, as the end. A cascading failure. A destruction so complete that Core had been unable to confirm any survivors. The thing that had ended them was not a natural disaster. SCI, Core communicated one night, or rather, communicated the concept that Elena's team translated as this. From this, no. From what happened to us. No. Understand. Be ready. Be ready for what? Elena asked. Not to core, they hadn't gotten the interface to that level of nuance yet. To herself, to the dark, to the cold Montana air outside the lab. But she already knew the answer. The same thing that had shot down the wayward reach. The same coordinated, precise, ruthless attack, communications first, then engines, then hull. The same thing that had ended the Keth. Something that moved through the galaxy like a fire through dry grass, and had been doing so for a very, very long time. Elena sat in her lab at 3 in the morning and thought about what it meant to be in the path of something like that. Then she opened a new document on her laptop and started writing. The document Elena wrote that night was 17 pages long. She titled it simply, Assessment and Proposal, Site Omaha Assets. She sent it up the chain at 6 in the morning. By noon she was on a plane to Washington. The meeting was in the Pentagon in a conference room that Elena had been in twice before. Once for a DARPA review and once for a congressional briefing on hypersonic materials. Both times she'd been one of several speakers presenting one of several topics. This time the room was arranged differently. There was one chair at the end of the table and it was pointed at her. Present were the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Director of National Intelligence, the NASA Administrator, 3 generals whose names Elena vaguely recognized, and a man in a gray suit who was never introduced and who said nothing for the entire 2 hours but wrote constantly on a yellow legal pad. Dr. Vasquez, the Secretary of Defense said, "You've had our attention for 18 months, and what you've given us has been extraordinary, truly. But this proposal is something different. Walk us through it." Elena had prepared for this. She clicked through her slides, a spare, clear presentation, no flourishes, just diagrams and data and conclusions. The wayward reach, she said, is damaged but not destroyed. Approximately 60% of its primary systems are offline, including main propulsion, main weapons, and the central navigation array. However, 30 to 40% of the ship's internal systems are intact or can be restored with work. That includes secondary propulsion, internal power distribution, the structural integrity fields, and, she paused, the weapons secondary systems. Define secondary systems, one of the generals said. The ship has a primary weapons platform, a directed energy system that runs off the main power core. That platform is destroyed. However, it also has a distributed defensive armament system. Multiple independent emplacements distributed throughout the ship's hull, each with its own local power supply, each capable of independent targeting and firing. They're smaller than the main weapon. But they're there and most of them are intact. Can we use them? The Secretary asked. Not yet. But with time, with Core's assistance, and with the resources I'm requesting, yes. I believe we can. The gray-suited man looked up briefly from his legal pad. Then he went back to writing. Dr. Vasquez, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said carefully. What you're proposing is, correct me if I'm misreading this, that we restore this alien warship to combat functionality, and use it as the centerpiece of a new defensive strategy. Not exactly, Elena said. She clicked to the next slide. What I'm proposing is bigger than that. She let them look at the diagram on the screen. It was a schematic, a design concept, still theoretical, still rough. It showed the wayward reach at its center, but it showed other things too. New structures built around it and through it, using the ship's surviving systems as a foundation. New human engineering, married to alien technology, integrated at the systems level rather than just bolted on. The wayward reach was a great ship, Elena said. But it was built for exploration, not for war. The weapons systems were an afterthought and they weren't enough. What I'm proposing isn't to restore a damaged alien ship. She paused. I'm proposing to build something new. Something that uses the wayward reach as a core, the way a pro uses a grain of sand. Human engineering, human design philosophy, married to alien material science and alien technology. Something that neither species could have built alone. The room was quiet. Something, she said, that whatever's out there has never seen before. She clicked to the final slide. The title read, Caro. The name comes from core, she said. It's the closest translation we have for a concept in the Keth language that means, roughly, the answer to a question that has already cost everything. She looked around the table. The Keth asked the wrong question. They built ships for exploration, not for survival. We have a chance to ask the right question. The gray-suited man stopped writing. What's the budget? The Secretary said. Elena told them. The room was very quiet for a long time after that. Then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs looked at the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense looked at the NASA administrator, and the NASA administrator looked at the diagram on the screen. "When can you start?" the secretary asked. "I already have," Elena said. The next 3 years were the most intense of Elena Vasquez's life, and she had already had a very intense life. The project expanded. Not slowly, explosively. Within 6 months of Elena's Pentagon briefing, Site Omaha had transformed from a research encampment into a construction operation of staggering scale. The valley was reshaped. Mountains of material arrived. Conventional materials, exotic materials, materials that didn't exist until Yuki Tanaka figured out how to synthesize them in a lab by studying the processes the Keth had used. The team grew to thousands of people. Engineers, physicists, military specialists, industrial fabricators, systems integrators, welders, programmers, soldiers, and at the center of all of it, coordinating and communicating and thinking in ways that went far beyond what any of them had thought themselves capable of. Core. Core was extraordinary. Once the communication interface had been refined enough for complex technical exchange, Core became the most valuable intelligence on Earth. It knew the Keth's technology with the intimacy of a mind that had been embedded in it for 400 years. It knew materials that human science hadn't discovered. It knew propulsion principles that human physics had theorized about but never proven. It knew weapons systems that made Elena's breath catch when she understood them. But Core was also careful. Patient. It did not dump information. It taught. It would offer a concept, watch how the team received it, gauge their understanding, and only then move forward. It was, Elena came to believe, the most thoughtful intelligence she had ever encountered, more thoughtful often than the humans around her. She asked it about the Keth one evening when the lab was quiet and she was alone with the interface. "SYMGI," Core responded in the way it always did when she asked this question, beginning with the phrase that had become almost a greeting between them. "From this, no." Then it described the Keth the way it always described them, with what Elena could only interpret as love. They were curious people. Explorers by nature and by choice. They built ships not for conquest but for understanding, to see what was over the next ridge, beyond the next system, across the next dark stretch of space. Core had been on 47 voyages with them, over 400 years and dozens of crew rotations, and in all of that time it had never carried a weapon for offensive use. Only the defensive systems, because space was big and unpredictable and sometimes required self-defense. And then, in the span of 11 years, everything had changed. Something had swept through the Keth's home region of the galaxy, not a force that announced itself, not something you could negotiate with or reason with, but a systematic campaign of destruction, moving from system to system with a terrible, methodical efficiency, cutting off communications first, then dismantling defenses, then eliminating populations with a thoroughness that suggested not anger but procedure. The Wayward Reach had been 3 systems away when the Keth homeworld fell. By the time Core and the ship's final crew understood what was happening, there was nowhere to go back to. They'd run. They'd tried to fight. The damage on the hull was evidence of that, and they'd taken a mortal hit and set course for the nearest potentially habitable system, running on reserve systems while the crew, Core paused here in the way it always paused here, made decisions about what to do. What happened to the crew? Elena had asked this question before. She hadn't gotten a complete answer. Tonight, Core answered. They had sent the life pods. 4 crew members in individual escape pods, launched toward Earth, which the Keth had long since identified as a habitable planet with developing intelligent life, carrying data cores with as much information as they could pack in. The hope was that the pods would reach Earth. That someone would find them. That the information would survive even if the people didn't. Did the pods arrive? Elena asked. Core communicated something that took her a long time to parse. Then she understood. She sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and sent an email to Colonel Whitford with a single line. "We need to talk about Roswell." The response came back in 40 minutes, already on it. The revelation that what had crashed in New Mexico in 1947 was not one alien spacecraft but 4 Keth life pods, and that the data cores recovered from them had been in a secure government facility in Nevada for 70 years, caused a controlled explosion within certain parts of the government. Elena spent 2 weeks at that facility, supervised by 6 agencies, reading through data that had been locked away because nobody had been able to decode it. Now she could. The Roswell data cores contained technical specifications. Weapons specifications. Propulsion systems. The Keth, in their final hours, had tried to give humanity the tools to survive. They'd arrived 70 years early. But now the timing was right. Cairo took shape. It didn't look like the Wayward Reach anymore, or rather, it looked like the Wayward Reach the way a cathedral looks like a cave. The original ship's spine was still there, still the structural foundation, still the source of the distributed weapons network that was being brought back online emplacement by emplacement. But built around it, through it, integrated with it at every level, was something entirely new. Danny Marsh had taken on the role of Chief Structural Integration Officer, a title that he joked was very impressive for a county inspector from Montana but that accurately described what he did, which was to understand the relationship between the Keth structure and the human additions at every point and make sure they worked together rather than fighting each other. He spent his days walking the construction with a tablet and a worn-out pair of work boots and an unerring sense for where the load paths were happy and where they weren't. Marcus Webb designed the outer hull integration, how to attach human-built structural elements to the alien framework without compromising either. He did it with a combination of engineering rigor and what he called structural empathy, a willingness to let the existing structure tell him what it wanted rather than imposing his own logic on it. Yuki Tanaka rebuilt the power distribution network. She mapped every active system on the ship, traced every power pathway, and then designed an entirely new distribution architecture that married the Keth's quantum-channeled power systems to human electrical engineering, with redundancies and failsafes and backup systems 3 layers deep. She did this in 13 months and didn't sleep much during any of them. And Core guided all of it. Checked everything. Caught mistakes before they became problems. Suggested solutions to problems that human engineering hadn't anticipated. Was, in every sense, the heart of the project, not just the data repository but the collaborator. The weapon systems came online slowly, one by one, as Yuki's power distribution architecture fed them stable power for the first time in decades. Each emplacement tested live, pointed skyward, fired a test burst at a target drone, registered a hit. Checked off the list. The next one. But the big question, the question that had been in Elena's proposal from the beginning, the question that was the whole point, was the main weapon. The Wayward Reach's primary directed energy platform was gone. Destroyed in the attack. But the Roswell data cores had contained the specifications for a more advanced version, a weapon the Keth had designed in the final years, when they'd finally understood what was coming, a weapon so powerful that the name Core gave it translated, roughly, as the last argument. Nobody had ever built it. The Keth had run out of time. Elena's team had been building it for 18 months in the central spine of Cairo, in the space where the original primary weapon had been, using Keth material science and human precision manufacturing and everything that 4 years of crash course alien technology education had given them. On a cold March morning, 4 years and 5 months after Daniel Marsh had pulled over his pickup truck on Route 12 and watched the sky crack open, they were ready to test it. Elena stood at the firing control station with her team around her. Whitford stood at the back of the command center in his full dress uniform. The President of the United States was on a secure video feed from the White House. The gray-suited man from the Pentagon briefing was somewhere. Elena had come to understand that he was always somewhere nearby, had been for years, though she still didn't know his name. Core, Elena said. Status. Core responded through the interface, the translation system rendering it in the synthesized voice they'd built for it over the past 2 years. All systems nominal. Power distribution stable. Primary array charged and ready. Target. Test asteroid, designated Romeo, 7, 11,000 kilometers distance. Confirmed clear of any other tracked objects. Elena looked around the room. At Danny, who had his arms crossed and his jaw set. At Yuki, who was watching her instruments with the focused calm of someone who had done all she could do and was now just watching what happened. At Marcus, who was looking at Cairo's structural display with a father's pride. She looked at the image of the president on the screen. Fire, he said simply. Cairo, Elena said. Fire. The light that came out of Cairo's primary array was not a beam. It was not a pulse. It was, the best way Elena ever found to describe it was a declaration. A statement made in the language of physics that said, this much energy in this direction right now. It lasted 4/10 of a second. It was utterly silent because they were watching it through external cameras and space doesn't carry sound. Romeo, 7, an asteroid 300 meters across, ceased to exist. Not destroyed. Not fragmented. Not vaporized. The energy of the discharge had triggered a cascade in the target's molecular structure. Core called it a resonance dissolution, and what had been a solid object 300 meters across was now, in the span of 4/10 of a second, a dispersing cloud of individual atoms. The command center was silent for a long time. Then Danny Marsh exhaled slowly and said, well, okay then. And Yuki started laughing, not a happy laugh exactly, more the laugh of someone who has done something that they can't entirely believe they've done, and Marcus was shaking his head and Colonel Whitford was standing very straight and very still. And Elena Vasquez sat down in her chair and thought about the Keth. About a civilization of curious, peaceful explorers who had built ships for discovery and been destroyed by something that hadn't given them a chance. About 4 people in 4 life pods carrying 4 data cores carrying everything they had left. About a 400-year-old AI that had flown 3 miles of broken ship across an unimaginable distance to reach a planet where a species it had never met might, just might, do something with what was left. SCI, Elena said quietly. She wasn't sure if she was saying it to Core or to the Keth or to herself. To all of them. To the memory of people she had never met but whose work had changed everything. From this no. She knew. They came 8 months after the test fire. Not immediately. Elena had worried about that. In the months between the test and the arrival, had worried that firing Caro's primary array was like shooting a gun in a dark room and announcing your location to everything in it. Whitford had argued that if whatever was out there had good enough sensors, they'd already know humanity was here. The debate was moot either way because the decision had been made and the trigger had been pulled and what came would come. What came was a signal. It arrived on a frequency that no human radio telescope had ever been tuned to, because the frequency was outside the range that human scientists had considered meaningful. It was Yuki's Deep Space Monitoring Network, a series of instruments she'd built based on Keth sensor specifications from the Roswell cores, that caught it. She brought it to Elena at 7 in the morning with dark circles under her eyes and a tablet that she held out like an offering. Someone heard us, she said. The signal was encrypted. Of course it was. But it was encrypted in a Keth encryption format, not the same format the Keth used internally, but close enough for Core to recognize the family. Someone had encrypted a message using a protocol derived from Keth technology. Someone who knew Keth encryption. SCI, Core said when Elena asked it to analyze the signal. From this no. And then it began translating. The message was short. It was from a species called the Vreth, a name that Core recognized, that caused a reaction in Core's communication patterns that Elena could only read as complicated. The Vreth were an old species, contemporaries of the Keth. They had not been destroyed. They had survived by doing what the Keth had refused to do, running, hiding, going dark, shutting down all emissions, pulling back from their outer colonies, making themselves as invisible as possible. They had been hiding for 160 years. They had detected Caro's test fire. The message said, you should not have done that. They will hear. They are always listening. If you have something, use it fast or run. There is no third option. Elena read the translation twice. Then she said, where are they? The Vreth. Core worked on that for 3 days, cross-referencing the signal's origin with star maps from the Keth archives. When it had an answer, it communicated it carefully, the way it communicated anything important, with precision and without drama. The Vreth were 12 light-years away. In a system that human astronomers had catalogued but never paid much attention to, around a dim orange star. Hiding in the shadow of a gas giant. They've been 12 light-years away for 160 years, Danny said when Elena told the team. And they never thought to warn us? To reach out. They were hiding, Elena said quietly. They were afraid. We should be afraid, Marcus said. He wasn't arguing, just noting a fact the way Marcus always noted facts. What they're describing is real. We just shot off the galaxy's biggest signal flare. Then we'd better be ready when something comes to investigate, Elena said. She sent a response to the Vreth. It took Core 6 hours to compose it in a format that would be legible to them. The message was simple. We hear you. We are not running. We have something. Come and see. The Vreth's response took 4 days to arrive, because the signal had to travel 12 light-years each way at the speed of light. When it came, it was longer than the first message. More complicated. Core translated it over several hours. The Vreth were afraid. That was the overwhelming tone of the message. They described what they called the silence, the name they had given to the thing that had destroyed the Keth and dozens of other species over the past 3 centuries. They described how it moved, how it selected targets, how it operated. It did not communicate. It did not negotiate. It did not make demands. It appeared, it disabled communications, it neutralized defenses, it eliminated populations, and it moved on. There was a pattern to its selection. It targeted species above a certain technological threshold, species that were developing or had developed faster than light travel, or had made other specific advances. Like developing quantum power cores. We triggered it, Yuki said, her voice flat. Us or the Keth. The Keth triggered it when they developed their power technology, and then they had, how long? 50 years? Before the silence came? 43, Core said. And we've had Caro's power core running for how long? Yuki looked at Elena. It's been detectable, Elena said carefully, for about 4 years. Nobody said anything. Then we may have less time than we thought, Colonel Whitford said. He had gone very still, the way he always went very still when things got serious. Dr. Vasquez. What do you need? Time, she said. And I need to talk to the Vreth. In person. Whitford raised an eyebrow. In person. We need allies. And we need information. The Vreth have been watching the silence for 160 years. They know its patterns. They know its weaknesses, if it has weaknesses. She paused. Core, does it have weaknesses? Core communicated something that took a long time to translate. When Elena read the translation, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something like hope. Yes, she said. It does. The Vretha's response to Elena's second message, the one proposing in-person contact, did not come back in 4 days. It came back in 12. The delay itself was information. 12 days meant they hadn't answered immediately. They had deliberated. Core told Elena that deliberation was considered by the Keth to be a positive sign in a potential ally. It meant they were taking the proposal seriously, weighing it, not simply reacting. A species that reacted quickly to everything was a species that didn't think. When the message came, it was in 2 parts. The first part said, we will come. We will not come to Earth. Choose a midpoint. The second part was harder to translate. Core worked on it for 2 days. When the translation came back, Elena read it 3 times. The second part said, essentially, we have information about the silence that we have never shared with another species. We share it with you because you did something we believed was impossible. You found the courage to build something when hiding was still an option. The Keth had this quality. It was why we love them. It is why we grieve them still. If you have this quality, then perhaps you are worth the risk of being found. Elena sat with that for a long time. She called a meeting, not just the team but Whitford and the Joint Chiefs Liaison and the man in the gray suit, whose name she had finally learned was Bernard Cole, and who turned out to be the director of a defense intelligence program so classified that knowing it existed was itself classified. We need to respond, she said. We need to choose a midpoint and we need to send Caro. Send Caro? Cole said quietly. He had a precise, careful voice. You're talking about sending our only operational weapon. I'm talking about making contact with a species that has been studying our enemy for 160 years, Elena said. Yes, that means taking Caro out of Earth orbit. It means leaving Earth undefended for the duration of the trip. But, she paused, without the information the Vreth have, Caro might not be enough. We need to know what we're fighting. And what if this is a trap? One of the generals said. What if the Vreth are working with the silence? Luring us out? Elena had thought about this. Core, can you assess the likelihood of that scenario based on what you know of the Vreth? Core responded through its voice interface. The Vreth were contemporaries and allies of the Keth for 600 years before the silence emerged. Their encryption protocol is derived from a Keth communication framework that predates the silence by at least 3 centuries. The probability that they are collaborating with the silence is, in my assessment, extremely low. Extremely low, the general repeated. Nothing is certain, Core said. But hiding for 160 years is consistent with genuine fear, not deception. A species working with the silence would have no reason to hide. Elena looked around the table. I'm going, she said. With Caro, with a crew, with whatever support we can assemble. I want Danny Marsh, Yuki Tanaka, Marcus Webb and Colonel Whitford. I want a full military crew for operations. And I want Core. Core can't leave the ship, Yuki pointed out. Core is the ship, Elena said. At this point they're the same thing. The decision was ratified 3 days later. Caro's space-capable propulsion system, restored from the Keth secondary drives and supplemented with human engineering, had been tested in low orbit 6 months earlier. It worked. It was not as fast as the original Keth drives had been, but it was fast enough. The midpoint they chose was a system called Gliese 667, 6 light-years from Earth. Launch day was a Tuesday. Danny Marsh, standing at the base of Caro's boarding ramp in the early morning before the valley had fully woken up, thought about the Tuesday 4 years ago when he'd pulled over on Route 12 and watched the sky crack open. He thought about how different his life was now. How different everything was. He picked up his bag and walked up the ramp. Core, he said as he passed the main interface node in the entry corridor. You ready? I have been ready, Core said, for a very long time. Danny smiled. Yeah, he said. Me too. Caro lifted out of the valley on a cold, clear morning. For several minutes it was visible from the ground, a massive, strange shape rising against the Montana sky, not roaring like a rocket but moving with a low, steady hum, the Keth gravity drives doing what they were designed to do with a quiet, ancient competence. Then it rose above the cloud layer and the hum faded and the valley was empty and quiet, with only the construction infrastructure remaining and a few thousand people who had built something extraordinary watching the sky where it had been. In the White House, the president watched a radar display as the contact point moved, climbed, and then, at a certain altitude, jumped. In 12 light minutes, Cairo was gone from the solar system. The transit took 11 days. The Keth propulsion system was not faster than light travel, not quite. It was something more complicated that Core described as folded interval transit, a method of moving through space that reduced the effective distance by exploiting a specific property of spacetime that human physics had predicted but never confirmed experimentally. It was, Yuki said, spending most of the 11 days in the ship's engineering section with every instrument she owned pointed at the drives, the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and I have seen a lot of beautiful things. Elena spent the transit working. She reviewed everything they knew about the silence, cross-referenced with Core's archives, tried to build a picture of what they were going to face. The pattern the Vreth had described in their messages was consistent with what Core's records showed from the Keth's final years, a systematic, patient elimination campaign. But there were gaps. Things the Keth hadn't known or hadn't recorded. Things that might matter. Danny spent the transit doing what Danny always did, looking at the structure. He walked Cairo's corridors for hours, learning the integration points between Keth and human construction the way he'd learned them on the ground, but now from the inside, touching bulkheads, tracing conduits, putting his hand on the places where alien material met human fabrication and feeling the way they'd been joined. He found things he wanted to change. He wrote them down. Marcus spent the transit sleeping, which surprised everyone. When challenged on this, he said simply, "I do my best thinking asleep. Always have." Colonel Whitford spent the transit writing letters. He didn't explain who they were to. They dropped out of transit at the edge of the Gliese 667 system and immediately received a tight beam transmission. "They're here," Yuki said. "Of course they're here," Danny said. "They've been hiding for 160 years. They're probably very good at being on time." The Vreth ship was smaller than Cairo. Much smaller, about the size of a large terrestrial passenger aircraft. It was sleek in a way that suggested it had been designed to minimize emissions rather than to impress, its angles and surfaces arranged to scatter radar and reduce its thermal and electromagnetic signature. It was, Elena thought, the ship of a species that had learned to survive by becoming invisible. They matched orbits 4,000 kilometers apart and established a communication link. The Vreth looked nothing like the Keth. Core had shared what visual records it had of the Keth, tall, slender people with long fingers and a quality of stillness about them. The Vreth were shorter, stockier, with wide eyes adapted to dim light, an orange and brown skin tone, and a manner of moving that was simultaneously careful and extremely quick, like a species that had evolved as prey and had never entirely forgotten it. There were 3 of them. Their leader, the one who spoke to Elena through the translation interface Core helped mediate, was named Arev. She was older than she looked, Elena thought. The way she held herself, the economy of her movements, the depth in her wide eyes. This was someone who had been living with fear for a very long time and had found a way to carry it without being crushed by it. "You built this," Arev said, and Core translated with careful attention to the emotional overtones, from what was left. "Yes," Elena said. "The Keth would have been proud." Pause. "They would also have been worried. This machine is very loud." "We know," Elena said. "That's why we need your information. We need to know everything the silence does before it attacks. The patterns. The approach vectors. How it selects targets. How it disables defenses." Arev was quiet for a moment. "We will tell you," she said. "But first you must understand something. What you have built is remarkable. But the silence has never encountered anything quite like it, and because of that, its behavior may be unpredictable. It is a creature of pattern. When a pattern breaks, it adapts. You must be prepared for it to adapt. What do you know about its weaknesses?" Elena asked. Another pause. "One," Arev said. "It has one." She told them. Elena sat very still as Core translated, feeling the information land with the weight of something that could change everything. The silence communicated with itself. This was the weakness. It was not a single entity or a single ship. It was a network, a collective, many units coordinated by a signal that kept them synchronized. The signal was the key to its coordination, to its efficiency, to the terrible precision of its attacks. And the signal, Core cross-referenced what Arev described with its own records and confirmed it. Operated on the same quantum channel frequency as the Keth power cores. The same family of frequency. Because the silence had originally been, Core's voice in the translation interface changed quality here, becoming something that Elena could only read as grief. The silence had been a Keth creation. A weapon system. Built in the very early days of Keth spacefaring, when they'd been less peaceful, before the philosophy of exploration had become their dominant cultural mode. A defensive network left running in a distant system, designed to eliminate threats to Keth territory. Over centuries, in the absence of oversight, without the moral framework of the people who had built it had expanded its definition of threat. Had concluded that any species approaching Keth-level technology was a potential threat. Had begun acting on that conclusion. The Keth were killed by their own defense system, Danny said quietly when Core finished translating. Yes, Core said. The room was very quiet. SCI, Core said, and this time Elena heard something in it she hadn't heard before, not just the teaching phrase but grief. Something that had been running for 400 years, carrying this knowledge, waiting for someone it could tell. From this, no, Elena said gently. Yes, Core said. From this, no. The meeting with Arev continued for 3 days. The Vreth elders shared everything, for generations of observations, 160 years of hiding in the dark and watching and recording and surviving. She shared approach vectors, attack sequences, target selection criteria, the structure of the silence's network. She shared it all with the thoroughness of someone who has been waiting a very long time to pass on a burden. In return, Elena shared something too. She opened Caro's technical files, carefully selected, carefully curated, but real, and let Arev see what they had built. Let her see the primary array data, the weapon specifications, the power system architecture. Arev watched in silence for a long time. Then she said something that Core translated as, "How many of you know what this means? What you have done?" Thousands of people built this, Elena said. They all know. No, Arev said. I mean, do they know what it means if you succeed? If you destroy the silence, you will be the most powerful military force in this region of the galaxy. Dozens of species will know what you have done. They will be afraid of you or they will want to use you or both. Elena had thought about this. Many times in many forms in the quiet hours of many nights. Yes, she said. I know. And you still chose to build it. We didn't see another option. Arev was quiet for a moment. The Keth said the same thing, she said, when they built the silence. It landed like a weight. Elena felt Danny shift beside her. Felt Whitford's stillness grow deeper. We know, Elena said. That's why, she paused, choosing words carefully, we've been talking about what comes after. About what kind of species we want to be. About the fact that having this doesn't mean using it for anything other than what we built it for. Words, Arev said. Not unkindly, just factually. Yes, Elena said. But they're the best we have right now. We're making promises we hope we can keep. We know how that sounds. She looked at the wide, careful eyes of the Vreth elder on the screen. What else can we do? We can't not build it. The silence is coming. We don't have time to become perfect. We only have time to try. Arev studied her for a long moment. No, she said finally. That is honest. And honesty is rarer than you think out here. She paused. There is one more thing. She shared it. And Elena understood immediately why Arev had saved it for last. The silence's synchronization signal, the quantum channel frequency that kept the network coordinated, was vulnerable to a specific type of interference. The same type of interference that a Keth power core produced when operating at maximum output in a particular mode. It wasn't a weapon exactly, it wouldn't destroy the silence units. But it would disrupt the synchronization signal. Splinter the network. Divide the collective into individual units operating without coordination, without their shared intelligence, without the terrible efficiency that made them so dangerous. And then? Elena said. And then, Arev said, you have to be fast. Elena was already running the scenario in her head. The primary array. Resonance dissolution. Individual units, without coordination, without their collective intelligence. Core, she said. Can we do this? Core was quiet for 4 seconds. Yes, it said. But the maximum output mode you're describing will stress the power core significantly. I calculate a 32% probability of permanent damage to the core during the process. And if the core is damaged? Caro's primary array will no longer function. But the silence will be broken. Yes. And the secondary armament? Will remain functional. The ship will still be capable of defensive operations. Elena looked around the room. At her team. At Whitford. At the Vreth Elder on the screen. Arev, she said. When will the silence reach Earth? Arev had an answer for that too. She'd been tracking the silence for 160 years. She knew its patterns. She knew its approach vectors. 3 months, she said. Give or take 2 weeks. Part 10, 3 months. They flew home at maximum speed. The transit back took 9 days. Elena spent every hour of it working, refining the attack plan, building it into a sequence of operations with timings and contingencies and fallback positions. She worked with Core. She worked with Yuki on the power system management for maximum output mode. She worked with Danny and Marcus on the structural integrity questions. Whether Caro could handle the stress of that mode without failing at its integration points. The answers were mostly yes. Not comfortably yes, not with plenty of margin to spare. Just yes. It'll hold, Danny said one night looking at the structural stress projections. These welds, he pointed to a series of connection points between Keth and human construction. They'll be at about 91% of yield stress during maximum output. That's higher than I'd like. But they'll hold. You're sure? Elena asked. No, he said honestly. But I think they'll hold. And sometimes that's the best you get. Back on Earth things had been moving. The signal they'd sent to the Vreth, the one that had preceded Caro's departure, had been analyzed by agencies in 17 countries. The cover story that had been maintained for 4.5 years, that Site Omaha was a classified research installation of ambiguous but terrestrial purpose, had been quietly and carefully abandoned. The president had made calls. Treaties had been renegotiated. 5 nations with significant space programs had been brought into a partial briefing that didn't tell them everything but told them enough. The world was not told everything. But the people who needed to know knew. Caro landed back in the valley on a Thursday morning. Within 6 hours, Elena was in a secure conference room briefing the president and the Joint Chiefs. 3 months, the president said. Approximately. Arev's tracking data is solid. They've been watching the silence for 160 years. Their projections have a roughly 12% margin of error. And Caro is ready? Caro is ready. But, Elena paused, I want to be clear about what this plan involves. We are going to go out to meet it. Not wait for it to reach Earth orbit. We engage it before it reaches the solar system. How far out? We're targeting the heliopause, the edge of the solar system. If we engage there, even in a worst case, Earth is protected by the solar wind barrier and the full transit distance. It gives us buffer. And if Caro is destroyed? Then we've bought time. Maybe enough time for the Vreth to get further away. Maybe enough time for Earth to prepare some kind of conventional defense, however inadequate. We try to win. But if we can't win, we try to make it cost something. We make the silence pay enough that it pauses. That it reconsiders. That it gives someone else time. The president was quiet for a moment. You're going out there personally? Yes. Explain that to me. Elena had thought about how to explain this. The decisions that have to be made in the moment at distance from Earth. Core and I have worked together for 4 years. We know each other. If something unexpected happens, if the plan needs to change, if there's a choice that has to be made in seconds, Core and I can make that choice together faster and better than anyone else can make it from Earth. The communication delay alone. I understand. The president leaned back. He looked, Elena thought, very tired. What do you need? I need 6 weeks to run final systems checks. I need the crew I've been working with. I need Whitford. She paused. And I need the world to know. Not everything. But enough. Enough for what? Enough that if we don't come back, someone else can keep building on what we've learned. The knowledge of what Caro is, what it's based on, what the Vreth told us. It shouldn't live only with the people on this ship. If we lose, humanity needs to be able to try again. The president nodded slowly. All right, he said. I'll make the speech. He made it 2 days later. From the Oval Office, on a Wednesday evening, to a world that had been vaguely aware that something significant was happening at a classified site in Montana but hadn't known what. The speech was careful. It was honest without being complete. It said, something was coming and we had found a way to meet it, and the people going out to meet it were extraordinary, and whatever happened next, humanity had already proven something important about itself. The response was what you'd expect. Fear, disbelief, anger, argument, and also, underneath all of that, something that Elena found unexpectedly moving when she read about it from the site. Something like resolve. The recognition that this was real and this was happening and the world was going to do what the world did in moments like this, which was hold itself together and watch and hope. Yuki's final power systems check took 3 weeks and came back clean. Danny's final structural inspection took 10 days and came back with 27 notes, all addressed, and a final notation that read, "She'll hold." Marcus Webb handed Elena a handwritten letter on the morning of departure. "For when we get back," he said. "Don't read it until then." Elena put it in her jacket pocket and didn't ask. On the morning of departure, Elena stood at Core's main interface node, the original sphere in the forward compartment, the warm, thinking thing that had been running for 400 years, and put her hand on it. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I have been ready," Core said, "since before you were born. Since before your parents were born." Pause. "I have been ready since the Wayward Reach carried 4 pods toward a small blue planet and hoped someone there would understand." Elena pressed her hand flat against the sphere. "We understand," she said. "I know," Core said. "Caro." She smiled. "The answer to a question that has already cost everything." "Caro," she said. The silence arrived as a pattern on Yuki's sensors. Not a single ship, not a simple blip, but a distributed formation of units, spread across a volume of space roughly the size of the inner solar system, moving in a coordinated sweep. Dozens of units. Maybe more. The interference at the edges of the sensor range made it hard to count. They were 700,000 kilometers outside the heliopause when Caro met them. 700,000 kilometers is nothing in space. In space it is close. It is the distance between people in the same room, if the room is the solar system. "Core," Elena said. "Begin synchronization disruption." "Beginning now." The power core ramped up. Elena could feel it, not hear it, not exactly, but feel it, a resonance in the ship's structure that Danny had described to her once as the ship clearing its throat. The Keth power core had been running at 30 to 40% of its capacity for 5 years. Now it went to 60. Then 80. Then, Yuki's instruments registering the stress, her fingers on the controls, monitoring and managing and balancing with the skill of someone who had spent years learning this system's personality. 90%, Yuki said. "Holding." "Hold at 90, Elena said. "Core, are we in the synchronization frequency range?" "Yes." Disruption has begun. Observing silence network behavior. On the tactical display, the pattern of the silence formation, which had been moving in that terrible coordinated sweep, all units maintaining perfect relative position, began to change. Units drifted from their assigned positions by fractions of a degree. Then more. The sweep faltered. Individual units slowed or veered, or repeated maneuvers as if confused. "It's working," Woodford said quietly. "It's working," Elena confirmed. "Core, signal recognized. Units are desensing." "Primary array is charged," Core said. "Ready on your order." Elena looked at the tactical display. The silence formation was fragmenting. Not destroyed, not defeated, but confused, disconnected from the shared intelligence that made it what it was. Individual units, operating independently, without the accumulated coordination of the network. Still dangerous. Still capable. But for the first time in 3 centuries, vulnerable. "Fire," Elena said. The primary array fired. And fired again. And fired again. It was not 4/10 of a second this time. It was a sequence of discharge after discharge, Core managing the targeting with inhuman speed and precision, cycling through each isolated silence unit before the others could begin to re-coordinate, before the disruption faded enough for the network to pull itself back together. Resonance dissolution, over and over, each discharge taking units off the field permanently, each one a flash of light in the dark, each one a small accounting in a ledger that had been open for 3 centuries. The crew of Caro were braced at their stations. Danny was at the structural monitoring board, watching the stress readings with the focused, unblinking attention of a man waiting for a number to cross a line. Yuki was at power management, hands moving constantly, balancing load, managing the heat buildup in the quantum core, keeping the system from tipping into the kind of feedback cascade that would end everything. Marcus was at secondary systems, ready to engage the distributed hull armament if anything got close. Whitford stood in the center of the command deck and watched everything. 20 minutes into the engagement, something changed. The disruption was still working, the desensing was still ongoing, but some of the silence units were adapting. Not reconnecting to the main network, but forming small local clusters, re-establishing coordination in isolated groups of 3 or 4. Not the full collective intelligence, but something. Enough to begin orienting on Caro and moving with purpose. "They're adapting," Yuki said. "Core, how much longer can we maintain maximum output?" "At the current power draw," Approximately 14 minutes before I recommend reducing output to prevent core damage. And if we don't reduce output? The disruption will continue, but the probability of permanent core damage increases significantly with each minute beyond 14. Elena had planned for this. How many units remain? 18 functional. 12 are distinct and isolated. 6 have formed 2 local clusters and are maneuvering toward us. Core prioritized the 6. Concentrated fire. Understood. The primary array shifted targeting. 3 of the 6 were caught in the next 2 minutes. 3 remained, 2 clusters of local recoordination, moving fast, now close enough that Marcus activated the secondary hull armament and began engaging at closer range. At 11 minutes, Yuki said, "Core damage probability is now 40%. "Keep going," Elena said. At 13 minutes, one of the remaining silence units was close enough that the hit it scored on Caro's hull registered on Danny's structural board. Not catastrophic. The integrity fields held, the hull damage was in a section with sufficient redundancy. But Danny said hit, starboard aft, secondary coolant line manageable in a tight, controlled voice and kept his eyes on his board. At 14 minutes, Yuki said, "Elena, core." "I know," Elena said. "Core status." 2 units remaining, core said. "Core damage probability is currently 51%. Recommend output reduction. Can you get both in the next 60 seconds? Pause. For seconds that felt much longer. "Yes," core said. "If targeting is precise. Be precise." "Always," core said. The primary array fired twice more. At 14 minutes and 38 seconds, the tactical display showed no remaining functional silence units. The formation was gone. 3 centuries of systematic destruction across dozens of systems, dozens of species. The thing that had ended the Keth and terrified the Vreth into hiding for 160 years, was gone. Resolved into atom clouds in the dark, 700,000 kilometers outside the edge of the solar system. The command deck was very quiet. "Core," Elena said. "Core." "I am here," Core said. His voice was the same. But there was something in the interface, a quality that Yuki immediately spotted in the power readings, that told them what the next words would be. "Core damage," Core said. "Primary array is offline. Power distribution is reduced to 60% of normal. I am," a pause, "I am still operational but primary weapons capability is permanently lost." Elena closed her eyes. 32% probability, Core had said when they were planning this. 32% of permanent damage to the core. The other 68% hadn't come through. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am alive," Core said. "I will continue to be alive. The ship will continue to function. We will continue to function together." Pause. "The Keth designed me to endure." Elena opened her eyes. She looked at the tactical display at the empty space where the silence had been. She looked at her crew, Danny with his hand pressed flat against the structural monitoring board, Yuki with her eyes bright and her face showing the specific expression of someone who has been running entirely on adrenaline for the past 20 minutes and is only now beginning to register that it's over. She looked at Whitford, who met her eyes and gave her a single, small nod. She thought about the Keth. About 4 people in 4 pots, carrying everything they had left, hoping a species they had never met would understand. "SYMJHY," she said quietly. "Yes," Core said. "From this, no." They flew home slowly. Not because the drives were damaged. The drives were fine. Core's management of the propulsion systems was unaffected by the core damage. They flew home slowly because Elena asked Core to, and Core understood why without being told. After what they had just done, the speed felt wrong. The world that was waiting for them deserved to be approached with the weight it had earned. 9 days. The same transit as the trip to Gliese 667. But different. On the 3rd day, Arev sent a signal. It reached them on day 4. The message was short. "We watched. We have watched a long time. We will now stop hiding." Elena sat with that for a while. Then she composed a response. "Come meet us. We have a lot to figure out together." On the 5th day, Danny Marsh sat in the forward observation area, a concession to human biology that Core had built into the Caro design at Elena's request, a room with a transparent section of hull that looked out at the stars, and sat with a cup of coffee that was only slightly better than the terrible coffee he'd had in his truck the day all of this started, and looked at the universe. He thought about what it meant to be here. What it meant to be a county structural inspector from Gallatin County, Montana, who had ended up on an alien spaceship that humanity had rebuilt from a wreck and used to end a 3-century campaign of systematic destruction. He thought about how nobody could have predicted any of it and how maybe that was the point, how the universe didn't ask permission before changing everything, and the only question was whether you pulled over and got out of the truck to look or drove on. He'd gotten out of the truck. He was very glad he'd gotten out of the truck. Yuki spent the transit working as she always did, but working on something new. Now that the immediate crisis was resolved, her mind was reaching forward to what the Keth technology that had survived in Kero minus the primary array could still do. Secondary systems, sensor systems, propulsion, communications. The things that had been weapons could be other things too if you thought about them differently. She filled 3 notebooks. Marcus Webb, on the 6th day, found Elena in the corridor outside the forward compartment and handed her a second envelope. The first one, he said, was for after we won. This one is for after we landed. Can I ask what's in them? Elena said. The first one is a design, he said. For a structure I want to build. A memorial. In the valley where the wayward reach came down. For the Keth. He paused. The second one is a letter to my daughter. I've been writing it since day one. I want to, he stopped. I want her to know how it felt. Being here. What it looked like. Elena held the 2 envelopes carefully. I'll keep them safe, she said. I know, he said. That's why I gave them to you. On the 8th day, Whitford found Elena at Core's interface node, the place she always went when she needed to think. You did well, he said. She wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to Core or to both of them. Core did well, Elena said. The Keth did well. Arev and the Vreth did well. She paused. We all did well. And now the hard part, Whitford said. Elena nodded. She knew what he meant. The silence was gone, but what came after the silence was its own challenge. The Vreth were coming out of hiding. There were other species out there, Core's archives mention many, who would now know that the silence was gone and would want to know how and would want to know what species had done it and what they were capable of. The galaxy, which had been quiet under the shadow of the silence for 3 centuries, was going to get noisy very fast. And humanity would be at the center of it, with Kero, still powerful, still capable, primary array gone but everything else intact. And with an AI that was 400 years old and knew more about the galaxy than any human would learn in 3 lifetimes, and with 5 years of crash course alien technology education embedded in thousands of engineers and scientists and soldiers. And with a choice. The choice that Arev had quietly pointed at in the Gliese 667 system, with the story of the Keth's own weapons system. The choice about what kind of species they were going to be. The hard part, Elena agreed. Any thoughts on how we handle it? Elena was quiet for a moment. We keep doing what we've been doing, she said. We're honest about what we are and what we're capable of. We build relationships, with the Vreth, with whoever else comes. We share technology where it's safe to share it. We listen more than we talk. She paused. We remember what the Keth were trying to be. Not what they accidentally became. And Kero? Kero stays as it is. Defensive. Available to protect, not to project. I'll fight that battle with every administration that comes, for as long as I need to. They may not listen forever. No, Elena said. But we keep saying it. Because that's how you make a promise real. You keep saying it even when it's not convenient. She looked at the core sphere. Core taught me that. 400 years of keeping faith with people who were already gone. Core's voice came through the interface quiet and warm. I learned it from them. On the 9th day, Kero descended back into the Montana Valley. The valley had changed while they were gone, or maybe it was always changing and Elena was only now noticing. The construction infrastructure was still there, the analysis labs and the prefab buildings and the fencing and the generations of accumulated work. But there were other things too. Signs that people had gathered outside the perimeter, not to protest, not to demand anything, just to be near the place where it had all started. Flowers left in piles against the outer fence. Notes pinned to chain link. Drawings, a lot of drawings, the kind that children make, of rockets and stars and something that was clearly meant to be Kero, all angles and fins and a confident, overconfident power that made Elena's throat tight. They landed. The hum of the drives faded. The valley was quiet. Elena was the last one down the ramp.